Anaerobic meaning without oxygen. Although we live in an environment where oxygen is present and relatively rich, at about 4% of the atmosphere, unfortunately it takes a while for that oxygen to reach every single cell in multicellular organisms, which means that all cells have to be able to respire anaerobically for at least part of their life cycle or lifetime. Microorganisms survive like this. They're all able to do anaerobic respiration, and in fact, some of them prefer it. If you put them into a rich oxygen environment, they will still respire anaerobically. You're probably more familiar with the term fermentation. So we'll talk about alcohol fermentation, and that is a type of anaerobic respiration. In human beings, anaerobic respiration occurs during exercise, as I mentioned in the previous video. So there's oxygen in the atmosphere, you breathe it into your lungs, gaseous exchange takes place, that oxygen enters your bloodstream, but then your heart still has to pump that blood from your lungs to the rest of your body. And sometimes when you are exercising, your heart doesn't pump that blood fast enough, which means that an oxygen demand or an oxygen debt is created, where the amount of oxygen being supplied doesn't meet the demand. And under those circumstances, our muscles will do anaerobic respiration. These are a variety of different types of fermentation that can occur, and we'll come back to this when we talk about how we use fermentation in industry. For the purposes of your syllabus, we're only going to focus in on two sections or two types of this fermentation. So if we think back to aerobic respiration, in aerobic respiration we have glucose that is broken down in the cytoplasm through glycolysis into pyruvic acid. From there, the pyruvic acid will move into the mitochondrion, where the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation take place. At the end of that, we have lots of carbon dioxide that's been produced, some water that's been produced, but also lots of energy, which is stored in ATP. With anaerobic respiration, glycolysis still takes place and pyruvic acid is still created. But what happens to that pyruvic acid is then different. So the pyruvic acid then does not go into the mitochondria. Instead, a fermentation process takes place. You can see there it says no oxygen present. And the end product, the two that we're going to focus on, are ethanol and lactic acid. When lactic acid is produced, there's no carbon dioxide that is produced. When ethanol is produced, carbon dioxide is also produced. Now that lactic acid that we build up, that's what creates that painful feeling in your muscles the following day, because that's the acid environment of the lactic acid in your muscle, which causes paralysis, partial paralysis. But the good news is that lactic acid, when the oxygen supply increases, or when the demand for oxygen decreases, that lactic acid can then enter the mitochondrion and continue through the process of aerobic respiration through the Krebs cycle and the oxidative phosphorylation, which would then release the CO2. Just to point out to you, when we do lactic acid, or when the product is lactic acid, the type of anaerobic respiration is called lactic acid fermentation. And when the product produced is alcohol, we call it alcoholic fermentation. So they're both fermentation processes, but they're slightly different fermentation processes and they produce different products at the end. So glycolysis still occurs, pyruvic acid is produced, and it is then either converted to ethanol or to lactic acid. If it's converted to ethanol, carbon dioxide is also produced, and that's known as alcoholic fermentation. If lactic acid is produced, no carbon dioxide is produced, and that is called lactic acid fermentation. It's very important to note that anaerobic respiration, because we don't go through Krebs cycle and particularly because we don't do oxidative phosphorylation, fermentation produces a very small yield of ATP. From our previous video, you can see that in glycolysis we only produce 2 ATP. In Krebs cycle we would produce another 2, and then from oxidative phosphorylation we would produce 34. This is why fermentation has such a low yield for energy. It only produces the 2 ATP from glycolysis and does not produce the 36 other ATP
that are produced during aerobic respiration.
So, lactic acid fermentation. This occurs in mussels when there is an oxygen shortage or deficit. The pyruvic acid accumulates, but it can't enter the Krebs cycle because to go through the Krebs cycle you require oxygen. Instead, we make lactic acid, which then sits in the mussels. That lactic acid creates a temporary or a partial paralysis that forces the muscle to rest, forces the muscle to stop working. And when the muscle stops working, it then allows the oxygen concentration in the muscle to increase. That is what is known as the oxygen debt. It's the amount of oxygen that is required to convert whatever lactic acid has been produced into carbon dioxide and energy. And that stiffness that you feel, as I said, is those lactic acid crystals. This is one of the reasons why a warm down period after exercise is so important. It's not just about warming up for exercise, but also warming down. It allows your muscles to rest, but it still keeps your heart rate up more than kind of being completely at a normal blood pressure or a normal heart rate. It elevates your heart just a little bit to keep the blood flowing, to keep that oxygen coming, so that your muscles can then get over that oxygen debt and convert whatever lactic acid is there so that you're not stiff the following day. The last thing we need to look at is the use of fermentation in industry. Going back to this diagram that I showed you at the beginning, the most important 2 or 3 processes that we're interested in are obviously the use of lactic acid in lactic acid fermentation that produces our cheeses, our yogurts, and also then our alcoholic fermentation, which produces wines and beers and that sort of thing. Now, as you can see here, yeast is most often used for producing wine and beer, and definitely you can see it in bread as well, particularly if you have a sourdough. That sour flavor is as a result of the alcoholic fermentation that produces ethanol. I should point out that that doesn't mean that bread is an alcoholic substance. When you cook it, the alcohol evaporates. We say that it's very volatile. It evaporates very easily. So what you're left with is the flavor of the alcohol in bread, but not the actual alcoholic content. Saccharomyces, which you can see there, is a species of yeast which prefers anaerobic respiration. So even if you put it in an oxygen-rich environment, it will still do alcoholic fermentation. It prefers that process. Lactobacillus, which you can see under the lactic acid, that is used to make cheese and yogurt and soy sauce and sour milk and all sorts of things. Lactobacillus converts lactose, which is a sugar, that's a monosaccharide. It converts lactose into lactic acid. You can see there the others that are there, for example, Escherichia all the way on the right, that is also known as Escherichia coli. That's the bacterium that lives in your gut, produces acetic acid, vinegar. Acetobacter, which is also listed there, is a bacterium that you can actually use to make wine instead of using yeast. So instead of using a fungus, you can actually use a bacterium to make wine. You have to be very careful with Acetobacter though, because if you leave it for too long, obviously your wine will turn to vinegar, and that is why.
Compare aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So let's just sum up what we've done across these 2 videos. Firstly, aerobic respiration takes place in both the cytoplasm, which is glycolysis, as well as in the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. Anaerobic respiration only occurs in the cytoplasm because glycolysis is the only process that occurs that is similar. Fermentation also takes place in the cytoplasm. Aerobic respiration will only occur in the presence of oxygen, while anaerobic respiration generally occurs in the absence of oxygen, the exception being your yeasts, which will do anaerobic respiration even if oxygen is present. The reactants that are required for aerobic respiration, glucose obviously, but also oxygen. For anaerobic respiration, it just requires glucose. The results, the products of aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and water. Although carbon dioxide is toxic in large quantities, for the purposes of comparison, carbon dioxide is not considered to be toxic when we're just talking about respiration. In anaerobic situations, In animals, we produce lactic acid. In yeasts, they produce ethanol, both of which are highly toxic to cells. We've mentioned that the aerobic respiration has 3 phases or stages: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. Anaerobic only has 2, glycolysis and fermentation. And lastly, the energy yield from each of them. Aerobic respiration has a massive energy yield, 38 ATP, whereas anaerobic respiration has a very low yield, only 2 ATP. It's worth noting that the products of anaerobic respiration in humans or in animals, that lactic acid which is produced, can be completely oxidized, it can be completely broken down, so that even if you've done anaerobic respiration in your muscles, it can then continue on in the aerobic processes once there is sufficient oxygen for that to occur.